Hi, this is Jeff Mann, and I'm going to do another video project on the topic of why so many professional golfers use the intact left forearm flying wedge and geometrically flat left wrist technique. This is episode 5 of my video project, where I, as an amateur golf theorist, talk about the golf swing biomechanics used by professional golfers. Now, I'm going to talk about this flying wedge concept, which I suspect that many golfers have never heard about. The concept of a flying wedge was actually talked about by Homer Kelly in his book called The Golfing Machine. And in that book, he talked for lasted about a half a page, a very brief description of the flying wedge concept. And Homer Kelly talked about an intact left arm flying wedge combined with a right forearm flying wedge. And in a future video presentation, I will describe what Homer Kelly meant by those two concepts. I used to be a great believer in many of the principles advocated by the Golfing Machine book, and for many years I regarded myself as being a TGM literalist who thought that the Golfing Machine book as the Yellow Bible. But over the years I've come to realize that many of the TGM concepts are scientifically invalid, and I personally believe that the concept of the intact left arm flying wedge concept is not useful, because what Homer Kelly described was the concept of the club shaft being in line with the entire left arm. And I believe that this scenario where the club shaft's in line with the entire left arm only happens sometimes at the end backswing position, at the P4 position, and sometimes at impact. But during most of the downswing, it's impossible to have an intact left arm flying wedge. I believe that the correct concept to think about is the concept of a left forearm flying wedge, where the club shaft's in line with the lower 4 to 6 inches of the lead forearm, and I will describe it. I also introduced the concept of a geometrically flat left wrist. In Homer Kelly's book on the Golfing Machine, he talked about a flat left wrist at impact. However, I don't refer to a flat left wrist only at impact. I'm going to be talking about having a flat left wrist throughout your entire downswing. But my definition of a flat left wrist is not an anatomically flat left wrist, but a geometrically flat left wrist. And a geometrically flat left wrist alignment exists if the club shaft is in line with your lead lower forearm. So I'm going to start describing this concept, starting with Scotty Scheffler here. Now, Scotty Scheffler uses a very weak lead hand grip, and here I'm using my mouse pointer to point image 1. And if you look at his club shaft here, you could imagine that it's in line with his lead lower forearm, like that. You'll notice that his club face is open and roughly parallel to the back of his flat left wrist, and also parallel to the watch face area of his lead lower forearm. This image here is at P4.5. Here we are at P5 in image 3, and then at P4.5, 5.5 in image 4. Now, you'll notice that as Scotty Scheffler starts his downswing, he's starting to shallow his club shaft. And if you look at this blue line drawn over the back of his flat lead wrist, you can see it's more shallow at P5 and becomes more shallow by P5.5. But during this entire time, you'll notice, if you imagine that you can't see the radial bone of his lead lower forearm in this image, but you could imagine that the club shaft is in line with his lead lower forearm there, here, and here. And to keep your club shaft in line with your lead lower forearm, you can't afford to either bend your lead wrist or bow your lead wrist, because that would move the club shaft out of alignment relative to the lead lower forearm. So to keep that alignment, the lead wrist must maintain a fixed alignment, which I call a geometrically flat left wrist. And if you look at Scotty Scheffler left wrist in these images, which I define as being geometrically flat, it also looks anatomically flat, and that is only due to the fact that he uses a weak lead hand grip. I will go on and describe other golfers who use the same technique, and I will show that if you use a stronger lead hand grip, then the lead wrist will not look anatomically flat, even when it is geometrically flat. I'm now going to go to the next image, and I'll share this image. So here is Scotty Scheffler at P5.5. And what I want to point out, I've drawn a yellow line over his radial bone here, and you can see that the club shaft is in line with this yellow bone, and that represents an intact left forearm flying wedge alignment. I want to point out something that's very important, is I've drawn a green line down the middle of his lead upper arm. And if you notice that the yellow line is not in line with that line, and the reason is, as you start the downswing, what happens in professional golf is, at his P4 position, Scotty Scheffler had his lead upper arm adducted close to his anterior chest wall at his P4 position. But as he starts the downswing and the lead upper arm moves away from the chest wall, it also becomes less internally rotated. In other words, it's rotating slightly counterclockwise. However, to shallow your club shaft to a flatter plane like Scotty Scheffler, you have to pronate your lead forearm more, which means that this yellow line representing his radial bone is rotating clockwise relative to the green line. And that's why I don't believe it's possible to have an intact left arm flying wedge during the downswing if you shallow the club shaft like most professional golfers. So you can see here that he doesn't have an intact left arm flying wedge where the yellow line and green line would be in a straight line relationship, and they would both be in a straight line relationship with the club shaft. So that is why I always refer to an intact left forearm flying wedge. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And we are now going to follow the progression of Scotty Scheffler's downswing. So here he is at P6, here he is at P6.2, and here he is at P6.5. And if you look at this image and you look at his radial bone where in image 1 where my mouse pointer is pointing, you can see it's in line with his club shaft. And the same applies here in image 2. You can see as he moves from P6 to P6.2, there's a very small degree of counterclockwise rotation of his lead lower forearm due to a lead forearm supinatory motion. So his radial bone, if you look in image 2, is starting to rotate counterclockwise, but it's in perfect alignment with his club shaft. So the rotation of his lead arm is perfectly synchronized with the motion of his club shaft. If they were not perfectly synchronized, for instance, if his club shaft moved faster than his lead arm and the club shaft became angled in this direction, then his lead wrist would no longer be geometrically flat and it would be extended. If, on the other hand, as he started his downswing, he allowed the club shaft to angle backwards more in this direction, here where the mouse pointer is, then he would no longer have an intact left forearm flying wedge, and his lead wrist would become more bowed, which means that it's no longer geometrically flat. So what Scotty Scheffler does with amazing precision is that he keeps his left forearm flying wedge intact, and he maintains a geometrically flat left wrist throughout his entire downswing. As you can see here, now we're at P6.5, and you can see his radial bone is rotated even more counterclockwise, but in perfect unison with the club shaft. So he still has a geometrically flat left wrist. Now I'll go to the next image. And this is an image of Scotty Scheffler at P6, P7.5 and impact. So what's happening between P6.5 and impact, Scotty Scheffler is now releasing the club so that the club shaft can catch up to his left arm by impact. At the same time, as he's releasing the club, as I mentioned, between P6 here and P6.5, there's a small degree of counterclockwise rotation of his lead lower forearm's radial bone to allow him to keep his club shaft on his functional swing plane during that period. And if you look at his lead lower forearm's radial bone, it's still in line with his club shaft, which means he has an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. Now, between P6.5 and impact, you'll notice that if you look at the logo on his glove, or you look at the watch face area of his lead lower forearm, or if you look at his radial bone, all three of those components are rotating counterclockwise in order for him to square his club face, which is open here at P6.5. He needs to square it by impact. Now, while he's doing that, he maintains an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. Now I'm going to go to another golfer, and this is going to be Henrik Stenson. And I'm going to show you the difference between Henrik Stenson and Scotty Scheffler. They both use the same technique, the intact left forearm flying wedge technique and a geometrically flat left wrist. In other words, if the left forearm flying wedge remains intact, you by definition must have a geometrically flat left wrist. However, if you look at Henrik Stenson in image 3, notice how cupped his lead wrist is. It doesn't look anatomically flat as it was in Scotty Scheffler's swing. And the reason is that Henrik Stenson uses a neutral lead hand grip. And when you use a neutral lead hand grip at address, you rotate your palm over the club handle in a clockwise direction. And people refer to that as a two-finger left hand grip, while Scotty Scheffler only has a one-finger left-hand grip, and I'll demonstrate this later in the video presentation. Now, if you follow his progression as he goes down, now he's at P5, here he is at P5.5 in image 5, and in image 6, he's probably at P6.5. If you look at his club shaft relative to his lead lower forearm, they constantly it's straight lined aligned. And if you look at his radial bone here, or lead lower forearm, this area here, it's in lines with the club shaft. So he must be having an intact left forearm flying wedge, and he must have a geometrically flat left wrist. However, I want to point out something here. Notice the degree of cupping of his lead wrist at P4. Here it still looks cupped in image 4, that's at P5. And here at P5, when he's at P6 or P5.8, close to P6, it looks less cupped. And here, if you look at it at this angle, it almost looks anatomically flat, similar to the left wrist alignment of Scotty Scheffler. So he's changing his degree of left wrist dorsiflexion. So it's dorsiflex, cupped at P4, and then as his downswing progresses, it becomes less cupped, and it's now moving towards being anatomically flat. Then the question you might ask me, if the left wrist is changing its degree of cupping, how do you maintain a geometrically flat left wrist? And I will explain this later in this video presentation. So I'm going to the next image. And here is an image of Henrik Stenson completing his downswing. So here he is at P6.3. There is image 2 is P6.5. Image 3 is at about P6.7, and there image 4 is at impact. If you look what's happening, and you look at, imagine his radial bone here, you can see it's in line with his club shaft throughout his entire late downswing. In other words, the club shaft now is starting to release, and it's releasing on his functional swing plane so that it can catch up to his lead arm by impact. And while it's releasing, there's going to be a certain amount of counterclockwise rotation of the club shaft about its longitudinal axis in order to become square by impact. So you can see here his club face is open at P6.3, it's still open at P6.5, less open here at P6.7, and then square at impact. And the way he does that is he uses the standard technique used by professional golfers, and that is he uses a lead forearm supinatory motion. So if you look at the logo on his glove here, you can see it's rotating counterclockwise. Notice when he gets to impact, his lead radial bone here, I'm pointing to image 4, is angled slightly to the right. And the reason is, if you look at Scotty Scheffler at a comparable impact position, Scotty Scheffler's lead forearm is rotated slightly more counterclockwise towards the target. And the reason is why there is this difference is two factors are in play. One, you'll notice that Henrik Stenson positions his ball closer to the middle of his stance in this golf swing action, while Scotty Scheffler had positioned his ball very close to just being opposite his lead foot. That means that Henrik Stenson at the moment of impact has a greater degree of forward shaft lean. Notice that his hands are slightly ahead of the ball at the moment of impact. And to create forward shaft lean while maintaining a geometrically flat left wrist, you have to come into impact with slightly less lead forearm supination. So the more forward shaft lean you have, in other words, if you put your ball further back and come into impact with a greater degree of forward shaft lean, while maintaining an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist, you would have to have slightly less forearm supination at impact. Now I'm going to go to the next image. And this is an image of Henrik Stenson's hack motion graph. So this green graph represents his flexion extension graph for his lead wrist. And anything above this line is, you can see at the bottom there, represents extension is above this black line, and flexion is below it. You'll notice that at the top of his swing here, that's the P4 position, Henrik Stenson's lead wrist is extended. And as he goes towards impact, this is the impact line, by the time he gets to impact, it's marginally below the line, this horizontal line, so it's slightly palmar flexed. So during his entire downswing, his lead wrist is moving from being significantly cupped, extended at P4, to becoming less extended, and then eventually, frankly, palmar flexed at impact. And then you would think to yourself, hang on, I claim that he has a geometrically flat left wrist throughout his entire downswing. So how's it possible that his left wrist alignment can change so dramatically during his downswing, and yet I'm claiming he has a geometrically flat left wrist? And I will explain soon when I do some demonstrations how that is biomechanically possible. Now I'm going to the next image, and this is an image of Tommy Fleetwood. Now Tommy Fleetwood, in contrast to the other two golfers, Scotty Scheffler, who uses a weak lead hand grip, and Henrik Stenson, who uses a neutral lead hand grip, Tommy Fleetwood uses a moderately strong lead hand grip. So here he is at P5, and you can see that the club shaft's in line with his lead lower forearm there. Here he is at P5.3, and you see the club shaft, if you imagine it, is still in line with his lead lower forearm. And here he is at P5.5, and the club shaft remains in line with his lead lower forearm, which means he must have a geometrically flat left wrist. However, if you look at his left wrist, you can see it is significantly cupped all the way. It's cupped at his end backswing position, it's cupped here at P5, it's still cupped here and there, which means that it's not anatomically flat, but it's geometrically flat. In other words, as long as the club shaft remains in line with your lead lower forearm throughout your entire downswing, by definition, you must have a geometrically flat left wrist, even if it doesn't look flat. I'll point out another factor. Look at his club face in this image here, 3. It's definitely more closed relative to his club head path than Scotty Scheffler at a similar position. And the reason is it's not due to any manipulation like the motorcycle move, which a lot of people think that because the club face looks closed at this position, when he gets to P4 and 5, he must be using the motorcycle move, but that's not true. He's not using the motorcycle move. And the reason why it's closed relative to the back of his lead hand and the watch face area of his lead lower forearm is because when you adopt a moderately strong lead hand grip at address, then the club shaft's often closed 30, 40 degrees relative to the back of your hand. So when he comes down, and he's coming down the swing plane, the back of his lead hand is parallel to his swing plane. And the only reason why this is closed is simply because he uses a moderately strong lead hand grip. I'm now going to go do the next image. So here's a different view of Tommy Fleetwood. This is a down the line view. And you can see him here probably at P5.3, and here he is at P5.5 in image 2. Because the club shaft's in line with his forearm, I call that an intact left forearm flying wedge. And as I said, you must have a geometrically flat left wrist to maintain that alignment. And his left wrist looks cupped, but that doesn't matter because I said it's simply due to the fact he has a moderately strong lead hand grip. If you look at him here in P6, I've drawn two lines. The red line is drawn over his radial bone, and the yellow line is more down the middle of his forearm. And if you look at the club shaft, it's in line with the yellow line more than it's in line with the red line. And the reason is, if you adopt a stronger lead hand grip, you are rotating your hand clockwise over the club handle at address, which means that the radial bone is rotated more clockwise. That's the red line. So when you think of the intact left forearm flying wedge in a golfer who uses a stronger grip, call it three knuckle grip like Tommy Fleetwood, then your reference point should no longer be the radial bone, but just a line that represents the lead lower form, the yellow line. As I mentioned, if you look at his club face, this blue line, it's closed relative to his club head path, and it's closed relative to the back of his lead hand and the watch face area of his lead lower forearm, and as it is here in this image. And that's simply a natural phenomenon if you adopt a moderately strong lead hand grip at address. I'll go to the next image. And here is Tommy Fleetwood. Image 1 shows him at address, and you can see how strong a lead hand grip he has. I've drawn a red line over his radial bone, and you can see he has such a strong lead hand grip that his radial bone is rotated clockwise away from the target at address. Now, here he is at P6.5, here in image 3 at P6.7, and then at impact in image 4. If you look at him throughout his downswing, I mentioned he has an intact left forearm flying wedge, which means that the club shaft is always in line with his lead lower forearm there, here, and at impact. And if you see, I've drawn two lines here. Notice that the red line is rotated more clockwise at address to a similar, at impact, sorry, here in image 4. And it looks very similar to the amount it was rotated clockwise at address. And that's natural. So if you have a stronger lead hand grip and you come into impact, your radial bone is going to be less rotated counterclockwise. So Tommy Fleetwood is performing a lead forearm supinatory motion to close his club face. So you can see here in image 3, it's still slightly open relative to his club head arc, and then closes more, and then by impact it's square. But the amount of lead forearm supination he needs is very small, because when you adopt a very strong grip and you come into impact with the back of your hand nearly facing the bull target line, then there's going to be very little lead forearm supinatory action happening and very little counterclockwise rotation of the club shaft about its longitudinal axis happening. But what I'm focusing on now is that Tommy Fleetwood is using an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. So I've given you 3 examples of professional golfers who use this technique. And I'm going to now go into more detail by analyzing what's really happening during the downswing. So I'm going to stop sharing this image, and I'm going to go and turn on my camera. So I've turned on my camera now, and I'm going to do some demonstrations. So I'll move my chair out of the way. The first thing I want to introduce you to is the concept. Why do we call it a left forearm flying wedge? What's the wedge component? And if you look at me here, I'll do it this angle, and you're coming down, let's say at the top of your swing, you have a 90-degree angle, but the club shaft's in line with your radial bone. And I'm going to adopt a weak grip like Scotty Scheffler. See, that's a weak lead hand grip. So club shaft is more or less in line with my radial bone. The back of my hand looks almost anatomically flat because when you use a weak lead hand grip, it's not going to be cupped. So when Scotty Scheffler comes down his plane and the club shaft's in line with your forearm, I'm putting this piece of red cardboard to represent that relationship, to show you what I mean when I say there's a straight line relationship between the club shaft and your lead lower forearm, the lower 4 to 6 inches. And this red cardboard is just a visual representation. So as Scotty Scheffler goes down, he starts to release the club so it can catch up to his lead arm by impact. I'll step further away. And then he has to supinate his lead forearm to square the face. During this entire process, notice that the club shaft rotates in perfect synchrony with the lead lower forearm, which means you have an intact left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist. So I'll step up a little closer now. Notice the visual appearance of my wrist as I'm coming down. So Scotty Scheffler's at this position. He gets down to his functional swing plane. He's going to release the club on the functional swing plane so it can catch up to his lead arm by impact, and then he's going to rotate his lead lower forearm counterclockwise. If you look at my back of my lead hand and lead wrist, it looks pretty flat, consistently flat. Now, as I mentioned to you, that happens if you use a very weak lead hand grip. But now I'm going to show you what happens when you have a neutral lead hand grip. So I'm going to hold it here. This would be a weak lead hand grip. My thumb's at the 12 o'clock position there. I'm now going to rotate it clockwise to the 1 o'clock position, and now I can see two knuckles on when looking down at my hand. So that's a stronger grip, and that's I call a neutral grip. Notice when you have a neutral grip, the club face looks closed relative to the back of your hand because you've turned your hand in a clockwise direction. So when Henrik Stenson's at the top of his swing and he's got an intact left forearm flying wedge where the club shaft's in line with his lead lower forearm, it looks cut. And that's just natural because I said as you adopt. And as he comes down the plane from P4 down to P6, it's going to look relatively cut. But remember, I presented a graph of Henrik Stenson's hack motion data, and it showed that as his downswing evolves from P4 down to P7, his lead wrist becomes less cupped, less extended, and by the time he gets to impact, he looks like that. It looks slightly palmar flexed. So the question is, if his lead wrist is changing its degree of alignment from being like this, slightly cupped, to becoming slightly flatter, how do you maintain a geometrically flat left wrist? You would think that if he had a geometrically flat left wrist here, and then at impact it looked like that, wouldn't that move the club shaft out of alignment relative to the lead forearm? So this seems to be a puzzle that would seem to contradict my concept of the left forearm flying wedge, but I'll show you the reason why this happens. So I'm going to adopt a neutral lead hand grip like Henrik Stenson here. So, and then I'm going to radially deviate my arm. And I'm going to just keep moving around so you can see that the club shaft's in line with my lead forearm, but it's cupped, as I said. Now I'm going to do nothing more than go from radial deviation to ulnar deviation, right? You notice how my left wrist becomes flat? In other words, this is a natural phenomenon that as your lead wrist goes from extension, from radial deviation to ulnar deviation, and the left wrist looks less cupped. You can try this at home. Just do that. I'll do it from this angle. As you go down to ulnar deviation, it becomes flatter. In other words, while you have a geometrically flat left wrist and the club shaft remains in line with your lead forearm, its degree of cupping can vary, and it happens naturally, and it must happen because that's the way the body functions. So when you say he's becoming more palmar flex as he gets closer to impact, and the reason why that happens with Henrik Stenson is simply due to the fact that he's radially deviated, and as the downswing progresses, he moves to ulnar deviation. And if you maintain a geometrically flat left wrist, its anatomical appearance will change. But that does not mean you are disrupting the intact flying wedge. So I'll do it again there. Now, how do you disrupt the left forearm flying wedge? If you'll notice I have a certain degree of cupping there at this position. If I do this, move the club shaft in that direction, now I don't have a geometrically flat left wrist. If I do the opposite, if I deliberately bow my lead wrist and angle the club shaft there, then my left forearm flying wedge is disrupted. So to have an intact left forearm flying wedge, the club shaft remains in line with your lead lower forearm. Now, let's go to the situation with Tommy Fleetwood. So Tommy Fleetwood uses a really much stronger, and I'm going to try and do it here. So that's a moderately strong. So what you do to get a moderately strong is you take your hand and then you roll it in that direction, clockwise, and put your thumb, let's say, at the 2 o'clock position. And if I look down at my lead hand here, I can see 3 knuckles, 1, 2, 3. And if you do that, you'll notice that the club face now, relative to the back of the lead hand, is closed. So when Tommy Fleetwood comes down, the club shaft remains in line with his left forearm, but the club face, can you see it's tilted more to the ground? It's Scottish Scheffler's club face would be there at P5.5, but Tommy Fleetwood's is closed. That's simply due to the fact that he adopted a strong grip. But Tommy Fleetwood, similar to Henrik Stenson and Scottish Scheffler, maintains a geometrically flat left wrist. And when he comes into impact with a little bit of forward shaft lean, you'll notice his radial bone, I'm pointing it here, is angled more to the right. And that's a natural phenomenon. In other words, the stronger your lead hand grip is, the less supination you're going to need during the late downswing to square the face. Now, I've described the phenomenon of a left forearm flying wedge and the concept of the geometrically flat left wrist. And the question is, why do so many professional golfers use this technique? And to me, it makes so much sense. In other words, a professional golfer can't afford to be out of control. So when he starts at P4 and he comes down and he completes the downswing in this motion, as I'm demonstrating here, if he can maintain a geometrically flat left wrist and an intact left forearm flying wedge, then he has absolute control of the club face closing phenomenon as the club releases and comes into impact with a square club face and with how much forward shaft lean he desires. Now, what would happen if you didn't have a left forearm flying wedge and a geometrically flat left wrist? So imagine you're coming down and you allow your left wrist to suddenly bend in your downswing. You would come into impact looking like this. That's disaster, right? You flip in the club shafts past your left arm, your left wrist is now much more extended. And you see this in amateur golfers. They come down, lose control, and then they come in like that. Another thing that could happen is you could start the downswing with a geometrically flat left wrist. And what would happen if you accelerated your left arm so fast towards impact to try and square it like that the club shaft couldn't keep up. In other words, you didn't have perfect timing. What would happen, the club shaft lags behind your left wrist would become more bowed like that. Then you can see the club shaft's no longer in line with your lead lower forearm. And you see this phenomenon very frequently in beginner golfers, amateur golfers, is they don't know how to maintain an intact left forearm flying wedge, and it's disaster. So the left wrist is changing its angles during the entire downswing, and that would make it much more difficult to be a consistent golfer who's controlling the club shaft and the club face during the downswing. Now, although I've talked in this particular video presentation on this concept of intact left forearm flying wedge, there are two other techniques that golfers use that doesn't involve this concept of an intact left forearm flying wedge. So I'll give you an example. If you decide to adopt an ultra strong lead hand grip like Matthew Fitzpatrick, where you turn your hand so much clockwise at address that your thumb is now at the 3 o'clock position, and if you look down at your hand, you can see 4 knuckles. If you have that alignment, then you can see that you're in your entire downswing. The back of your lead hand is sort of parallel to the swing plane to P6, and then it's going to be parallel to the functional swing plane, and you'll come into impact with a square face, simply due to the fact that the club face, when you use a strong grip, could be rotated 60 degrees relative to the back of your lead hand, like that. So you come into impact, and all you have to do is ulnar deviate your lead wrist, and you'll come into impact like that with a square face. You didn't have to do this lead forearm supination. And therefore, I don't believe that the left forearm flying wedge concept applies to that subset of group golfers who use a very strong lead hand grip. There's another subset of professional golfers who don't use the intact left forearm flying wedge concept, and that is golfers who use the bowed lead wrist technique like John Rahm and Colin Morikawa. So if you look at those golfers, they could be bowed even at the end backswing position, but certainly when you look at them, by the time they get to P5.5, their lead wrist is already bowed. And then between 5 to impact, this is what they look like, right? They maintain a bowed lead wrist all the way. And when you have a bowed lead wrist, obviously the club shaft's angled back relative to your lead forearm, so you're not using the intact left forearm flying wedge technique. You're using this technique, the bowed lead wrist technique. And if you use the bowed lead wrist technique, because it angles the club shaft back relative to your lead forearm, you're going to use slightly more lead forearm supination to square the face. But it's a very valid technique. And, you know, Colin Morikawa and John Rahm are superb PGA Tour golfers with a perfect technique. So I've described there 3 ways you could perform a golf swing using your lead arm. You can use the intact left forearm flying wedge technique. You can use a strong grip where you just have to ulna deviate your lead wrist without any significant amount of lead forearm supination, or you can use the bowed lead wrist technique. And that's optional. In other words, all these 3 techniques work very well in professional golfers. But what I hope I've described here is how the intact left forearm flying wedge works and what I mean by a geometrically flat left wrist. And I've looked at a lot of professional golf swings, and many of them who use a weak lead hand grip or a neutral lead hand grip are using this technique, the intact left forearm flying wedge technique combined with the geometrically flat left wrist. I hope this explanation is informative. If you disagree with my opinions, feel free to post any criticism in the comment section of this YouTube video. I will now stop the recording at this time.